Welcome to Open Conversation, where community, education, and policy meet. I'm your host, Nalia Weber, the Executive Director of the Orleans Public Education Network, and today we're discussing parent advocacy in the student discipline process.
So as many of you know, the Orleans Public Education Network is all about making sure that parents have the access that they need to have and understanding the policies and practices so that they can effectively advocate for their students, their children, and to be able to effectively navigate this system from a place of power. And so this series is about providing parents with all of those tools. And today we're talking about something that brings up a lot of strong feelings, which is student discipline. And we're going to explore what student discipline is, what that means, how it shows up, and what parents need to know to be proactive should their child interact with the student discipline policies at their particular school. So thank you very much, India and Daphne, for joining us. We're very excited to have you, and we appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. Before we really get into it, let's talk about what student discipline is. Because you are a parent and an advocate, Daphne, in India as an educator, you guys have a lot of experience working with student discipline systems. So talk to us a little bit about how that is defined and what it means, student discipline.
Well, for me, student discipline, it's kind of like when a child is kind of, I guess, misbehaving, as the educators would say. For me, as a parent, because I've had basically three of my children in that system. I mean, for me, it would be they were frustrated, and so out of frustration came some type of behavior of frustrations. The student discipline part of it, and so when I always tell my children it's a cause and effect. So for every cause, there's an effect, and if they cut out in class instead of just coming to the teacher or coming home and telling me I have a problem, then they're put in some type of punishment. So that's what student discipline means to me.
Yes, I would agree. I would also say that student discipline is the component of the school policy that's focused on preventative measures to ensure that students are focused, alert, and on task at school, while also considering consequences that are in place when students aren't meeting expectations.
Okay. And I would like to hear from both of you, what does like in the development and the application of policies around redirecting young people with some challenging behaviors? I think that we can all appreciate that there are going to be some times when a young person is going to have some challenges with their behavior for a variety of reasons, whether it's because they're frustrated or they don't understand the work or they have something else that's on their mind that's preventing them to be really able to access the curriculum at that particular moment. And then we've all seen in our own work how take that through behaviors. But what is an equitable school discipline policy look like to make sure that young people are getting what they need and that children are not being singled out or targeted or way that it's more for one child than it may be for some other children?
I think that school policy that is equitable as it relates to student discipline is very much rooted in cultural identity. I think that it ensures that students have choice and freedom while also having structure that ensures that they're able to be productive. I think that in order to have an equitable discipline system, you have to have equitable classrooms, which means that you have to have teachers and leaders that understand equitable practices. And so I would say, first and foremost, equitable policies are in place when staff is intentionally trained on how to meet the needs of their students and also how to think about how to work with students. So more than anything, I think that equitable practices ensure that they first tackle the mindsets of the people who work with students.
Okay, thank you. Daphne, I'm sure you have a lot to say with this, given your experience as a parent and an advocate in this space.
Yes.
What say you about equity in the school discipline process?
Wow, I mean, you said the key word, a parent. To have the equity, you have to have the parent's voice in it. On several occasions, I went to schools. I sat with several teachers, principals, educators, and we sat down with a plan. And I've always said, sometimes it looks good on paper, but that parent needs to still go back to make sure that that they're getting their accommodations if they need accommodations. That they're able to have those things. And some schools were very, okay, this is what I see in the classroom, and I tell them this is what I see at home. And we meet each other halfway and make sure the child is getting all the accommodations and things that they need. So to me, that right there is equity when it comes to the schools.
What I think is interesting that the both of you two highlighted was equity in a school discipline process starts with the adults. And I didn't hear any of you say, well, it's about the child and trying to fix the child, but it's about making sure that teachers are on board and are trained in a way that takes into account a lot of things other than the behavior that they're just seeing, culture, background, and then also bringing in to co-create a plan to support that child in school, and then also holding parents and teachers holding each other in the school accountable. So I think that's interesting, and I think it's important to highlight. What I want to transition to now are the actual policies, right? Because we want for parents and other stakeholders who advocate for young people to be able to understand like what is actually written down, because that is usually what a lot of school system or schools are holding themselves accountable to. So what are the policies that are that determine student discipline? Are these based on what's going on in the school, what the schools are developing on that level? Is it local? Is it state? Is it federal? What are the policies that you found yourselves interacting with around student discipline?
Well, for me, it touches home with me. I've touched every level of when it comes to the policy. The local level, it's the state. It's just the point where I've touched every level. So it's on every level. It's basically law. When you deal with a child that has, as they say, special, the 504, needed a 504 accommodations, you're dealing with the schools. And then when I felt like that I'm getting some type of resistance, then I would go to a higher level, and just actually, to be honest with you, I was kind of lost at first, and I know we're going to touch on that later on. I was kind of lost at first trying to figure out the trenches and all that, but then I went to like the RSD, their school system, and asked them, and they were actually kind of helping me and giving me on some resources. So it's in the state, local, and federal level, all levels.
And can you name some of those policies on each of those levels that you in particular had to be aware of in order to effectively advocate for your child? Like, what was that local policy that you had to contend with? What was the school level policy?
Basically the 504, there's a law in place for that. The 504, I think it's a 504 law. That was one of the things, because like I said, my children had accommodations. And when I felt like those rights right there, when the rights are getting a little violated.
I think you're thinking about those with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, making sure that students with disabilities are treated with equity as it relates to their academics and behavioral procedures in schools.
Law, right? So that's their protections for them.
Yes, and that's a law that everybody in the nation has to follow. And within that, there are laws that basically talk about what instructional practices need to look like for students with special needs, what it needs to look like for students with suspected disabilities, which I think is also very important as it relates to students who struggle with behavior at school. It also lays out what needs to happen in terms of response to intervention, RTI, which is very much a necessity for parents to know about. There are handbooks that can help make sure that parents who have students with special needs or students with specific, if you suspect that they have special needs, you can have a parent handbook that essentially tells you what your rights are. But to kind of rewind a little bit, I think what's very important for parents to start with is by knowing the school policy, and you get that by getting the school handbook, right? So school handbooks essentially are built by charter schools or public schools. So for example, there's state law that says that schools can't suspend, says that if a student is being intrusive to the learning environment, a teacher can put that student out for a specific amount of time. And so schools take that law and they build their own plans. It's very important for you to know what the school plan is and advocate that the school follows that plan. That's number one, because schools will say, if a student does this, then that's the consequence. If a student does behavior 2, then this is the consequence. So as a parent, you want to make sure you're holding schools accountable to that, number one. I would say number 2, taking into consideration what schools need to be doing for intervention needs. If a student is consistently being suspended or punished for the same behavior, a parent has a right to advocate that the school puts in place an intervention for that child, because a school is not supposed to suspend or essentially discipline a student for the same behavior over and over again, because it means that that student needs some type of specific support. So if I were a parent in that situation, and what I would tell parents to do when I was working in schools and even now, it's important for you to ensure that you sit down with administration, with the teacher the student is consistently having issues with. Take notes on why the issue is happening, when it's happening. Make sure that you guys are clarifying a goal, strategies to meet that goal, and come up with deadlines so that you can check back in with the school. Also, keep all of the documentation, because a lot of times I think that parents feel like it's their job only to make sure that kids behave in school, and that's not true. It's a partnership, and it's very much on the school to create an environment where behaving well is easy, right? Like the classrooms need to be structured, behavior management needs to happen in the classes, teachers should work on having positive relationships with students, there should be practices in place that help kids solve their issues if they're struggling. There are lots of things that contribute to negative behavior. And so I think it's up to parents to essentially just know how they say they're going to operate as it relates to behavior, and then hold them accountable by being a partner with them, but also making sure that they do their part.
I want to say something on that part. I'm glad that she touched on the lower level. That is so true. The schools, they, like she just said, they have their own policies and procedures. And I left that part out, but that's the main essential. But also parents need to know, if you're not getting any type of assistance right there, just go higher. I think some parents get stuck on that same level, and then they're frustrated and stuff like that. But I'm the type of parent, I went higher, but which takes a lot of guts. So I appreciate you chiming in on that with the local part, the school itself.
And I think as a parent, it's always helpful when you have a parent who's a true, who's working on being an advocate. It's not always easy to know what to do. And I think that's the right thing to do. There are parent centers at the RSC that you can go to. There's always, for a school or a charter management organization, there's always somebody who's in charge of discipline that's outside of the school that you can talk to about your concern. And so I think that's always a good first step. Is who else is in charge past the principal within this region of schools who I can go to first. And if that's not working, then let me go to the school district. And then if that's not working, there are also advocacy groups that have parent advocates that you can use. And if you have to, you can get a lawyer if you need to, which hopefully you wouldn't, but if you have to, that's also an option.
Thank you both for that. So yes, like you mentioned, well,
with IDEA, that's a federal law that protects all students. It protects the civil rights of students with special needs and exceptionalities. You also have state policy, but when it really gets down to it, what you're interacting with, when that teacher calls you or that principal calls you or that dean calls you, they're calling you because of something that happened in violation of that particular school's policy, right? And then so you're starting there. You're starting with the location of where the interaction occurred, and then you're moving on from there. So when I think about school discipline, I'm thinking about a range of things, and I'm not just thinking suspension or expulsion. I'm also thinking about things like detention or demerits, some of these lower level things that can happen between students in their schools. So what I would like to talk a little bit more about is, what should those processes look like? So for example, yes, it is based on school level policy, but how are we using demerits? How are we using these positive intervention systems? How are we using detention? What should detention be looking like, right? So I feel like there's a lot of students that get involved in those kinds of systems, but who may not be suspended or expelled, but may be in detention a lot or may get a lot of demerits. So it's still a discipline. They're still interacting with some level of like discipline. What does that look like? How do we do that equitably to make sure that it's not just a punishment, but we're actually helping young people develop in terms of character and things like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, what comes to my mind, because my children are kind of older now, but I experienced that with one of my children, what was a lower level. And what I personally did, I talked with my child, and I was trying to get their side of what's going on, why you're frustrated. And they told me what the issue was. Then I said, okay, set up something with the school principal. Or if the principal, like she just said, they have negate those type of, like I think it's a disciplinary person that handles those. So we sit and talk and set up a meeting. Because I told them, and I let my child also explain, their frustrations. So from there, that's when they was like, they didn't get no 504 accommodation, but they still got evaluated in the classroom and at least got some type of, where they needed help with the math. So we're going to focus more on the math part. When it comes to the discipline part, I told my child now, I'm not all for it, but at the same time, when they're in that discipline part as well, because sometimes things happen. Let's just see if we can avoid that situation. As a parent, I was frustrated a lot of time. I had the Orleans Parish system and the RSD system. I had both systems. And so with both systems came, the Orleans Parish was more or less kind of helping. The RSD, I'm being honest, they want to do a lot of suspension. They wanted to do a lot of in-house detention, where my child would be just, doing a lot of stuff. And so like I said, on both ends, I had both of them. And the main thing is connecting with the teacher, connecting with the principal, connecting with the staff, and sit down with the child. And if they have to have that 504 accommodation, it's nothing wrong with that. I've had children to do that, and it ran pretty good. So that's what I think about that.
I basically think that you have to pay attention to the why. Why is the kid getting detention? Why is the kid getting demerits, strikes, losing paycheck dollars, whatever it is that you call it? Pay attention to the trends. Schools have to do that, and parents should do that as well, right? Is the trend that the student is getting detention because they're falling asleep in class a lot, or they're not completing their homework? If that's the case, then you have to rally together and find a solution to attack the problem. I've seen students go to detention for 20 days out of 30 days for not having homework. Maybe the homework is a challenge for them. Maybe they're academically struggling. Sometimes something like detention ends up being a Band-Aid instead of solving the problem. So for a parent, I would say advocate to sit down and figure out what the issue might be so we can find a solution, because detention doesn't always solve it. In terms of the environment for detention, I think if it's used as a strategy, it needs to be a calm place that's refueling for kids. Having kids sit in a room, be silent, not talk, and work, I don't think is restorative. I think it should be, a place where, kids can get help with their homework while they sit there. You can talk to kids individually about the behavior that they exhibited. Ask them how they feel. It doesn't have to play music, make it be calm, have apples there if somebody needs a snack. It doesn't have to be, punishment, punitive, like, so, just culturally shocking. Like, find a way to make it feel comfortable for kids. Also make sure that detention is not a place kids like to be at, by making it be, the fun popping place, right? Like, I don't want kids to come in here and feel uncomfortable, but I also don't want them to come here and think that this is the place where they can, hang out.
Exactly.
Yeah, but more than anything, I think it's about the trends. And I would say for parents to pay attention to some of the demerits and strikes, because sometimes it feels small and it feels petty. I would say that's a word that I've heard parents use. My child is losing money because they have to go to the bathroom. My child is losing money because they didn't have a pencil. And, sometimes at a lot of schools, those dollars are connected to school incentives. So if you're having a celebration or field trip, your paycheck average or your dollar or demerit average has to be a certain amount of money. So I'd say, as a parent, I would say advocate for your child.
So what I'm hearing is, well, one, I think that what we have to address is our language, right? So I really don't like the language of student discipline, right? But we're using it for this webinar because this is the language that we use throughout this school system. But what I'm hearing is, from the both of you, I'm not hearing discipline. I'm hearing offer opportunities to build relationships, understand young people and what they're going through and how that is influencing their behaviors, working with young people and families to address things, but then also on the school level, creating opportunities for reflection instead of detention, right? We think about discipline and we think about detention. This is the same language that we use when we're talking about prisons, right? In jails and institutionalizing people. And so I think that we would better serve young people, families, and school climate overall if we really shifted our language and our thinking around how to manage a multitude of personalities and behaviors. Now, I said before in that last question that there are some students for whom they'll never really interact with the discipline system at their school, or they may do so on a very low level. It might be a demerit. You might not earn some paycheck dollars. You might get a detention here or there. And then there are some young people who interact with it a lot, and who do get suspended and who do get expelled. And what we do know is that is a very direct line from that school to whatever prison is waiting on the other end of that, right? So can you talk a little bit more about how do we approach student discipline at the school level to prevent that? I can definitely kind of understand things from a school's perspective sometimes when you're dealing with violence at the school. Sometimes some people need to take a break. Sometimes the behavior is a danger to the student or to other students, and so additional measures may need to be taken. But how do we work with those challenges without putting kids on this pipeline? So this one is more about using our imagination. What would that look like?
Actually, when you go outside of the resources go to outer resources, connecting with other social worker agencies to come in. And, parents work all the time. I'm a parent, I work so much. So I might not be able to get there and talk to my child if something is going on to fight. Children love just to be heard. And when they're not heard, that's one of the reasons they act out, when they feel like they're not being heard. So I personally connected with another agency, a social worker agency. And when I was not able to come in, they were coming in, speaking with the speaking with the staff, speaking with the school. My child sometimes would have time out with the social worker because some of the counselors and things that are in school, their hands are tied with other little activities. So you have to step out sometime and get other resources besides the inner one. So just stepping out, I wanted to put that in there earlier. Getting other agencies involved. It's not bad because, like I said, as a parent, we work all the time. So you have to have someone else there besides, if you trust the school staff, fine. But if you kind of like, oh no, now like she said earlier, some of that stuff is a little petty, but can you come over there and, kind of assist my child with X, Y, and Z? And most of the times they will.
You working in a school from the perspective of a person who often works with students with a variety of behaviors, how could a school implement a policy or a set of practices that addresses students' needs without putting them on a pipeline to a place where we don't want them to go?
Yes, I think that's great. A great question. I think the very first thing we need to do is rooted in what I said earlier, which is starting with making sure that we talk about race and equity in schools. We need to make sure that our staff understands the population that they're working with, number one. A lot of times, especially in New Orleans, teachers are not from New Orleans. I wasn't from New Orleans. Just because I was a person of color working with a bunch of students who are people of color didn't mean that I automatically understood what they desire, who they are, what they need, what makes them happy. So do that research. Have those conversations with each other. Talk about what it means to get to know students and see the whole child. Talk about what it means to have positive expectancy, what it looks like to have an appropriate conversation with a parent, what it looks like to not make assumptions about kids. All those things are important because what we think and what we believe about students impacts the way we treat them. And the way we treat students impact the way that they behave. So I first think we need to think about that. In terms of policy at school, we need to think about restorative practices. A lot of times we develop these schools and we have these great ideas about what it's going to look like. And when things start, it doesn't always work that way. So be responsive by paying attention to your practices and revising them as you move forward. You might have had a plan that you thought was going to work and you see that, it's not working anymore. That's okay. Let's revise the way that we do things. A lot of teaching, 21st century education. Is that true? Are we really having 21st century practices? Because if that's true, kids will be doing webinars. They're going to be on the internet all the time. They're going to be producing their own music in classes. Our kids these days know how to do everything. Does the school day reflect that, right? Think about what your school day is. Is it making kids excited? Are they invested in the school day? Or is it rigid? Does it have the ability for them to have choice? Or does it want every kid to be the same? Does it allow their voice to be heard? Or does it shut the child down and tell the child to think about those things? More than anything, one of the things that I tell parents and I tell my friends and I tell myself, school should be the places that we would send our kids. And I think that that's important for a parent to know when they're dealing with administration and teachers. What school does your administrator's child go to? Do they go to this school? Do they go to schools like your school? What kind of practices do you think that this person expects to have at their school? And make sure that they treat your child that same way. I would also say that schools need to make sure that they have proper RTI teams and special education teams. Often they have special education because you have to. You have to. There's a law. There's so many laws that would get the school shut down if they don't have proper special education protocol. But a lot of schools, I might be generalizing, but from my experience, I have seen schools deny response to intervention and kids aren't getting proper intervention, which means that there are students who are in these classrooms who need extra support and they're not getting it. Intervention teams make sure that kids who need counseling can get it, kids who need extra support get it, kids who need to take breaks get it. If you're not putting time into building a team that pays attention to data to identify who is behaviorally and academically struggling, then you're going to have kids who are acting out because they need help. And it's not their fault. you know, that they're struggling. Yes, I'm struggling academically. I'm on a first grade level. I'm in fourth grade. So now when teachers are asking me to do this work, it's frustrating me and it changes my behavior. So if schools think about that in a preventative way, then they avoid those things. And the last thing I would say that's very important is, as a parent, as schools, know what resources exist outside of the school, similar to what you were saying, Ms. Daphne. There were a lot of times as the administrator when I was extremely frustrated because I felt like I had done everything within my know-how to do for a kid. And there were a few organizations that I could call on, a couple of agencies where we could get kids mental health support and mentoring organization. But I always had a hard time as an administrator figuring out who my allies were in education. And so I think that's always important to figure out what other organizations you can work with to support students and support schools.
She touched home. I realized with me, I had a different learning style. Growing up as a kid, a lot of schools have a lot of electoral. And I realized that checking on my children as well, having an environment where it's different learning styles, you know, the hands-on, the audio, it's just a lot of things. And not all schools foster various learning styles. So you need to know that children do have different learning styles. You know, I'm a person, I learn by hands-on, and I got to touch it and see it. I'm a visual learner. I mean, and I think most kids now are visual learners. They have to see it, you know, the PowerPoint presentations and things like that. So I ran into a lot of problems with that, having the right learning environments for my child.
To prevent a lot of the behaviors that you see after that. To hear the both of you speak, it reminds me of this quote that if a flower is struggling to grow, you don't change the flower, you change the environment, right? And that then gives that flower what it needs to thrive. So thank you both for that. I will ask you this. Who are, in thinking about helping parents to be proactive, all right? So let's say I am a parent, it's a new school, it's a new school year, I'm going into this place and I want to be proactive and to prevent any kind of issues with my child interacting with the discipline system. What tools or what information do you think that parents should be equipped with or ask for day one of school to help them throughout the school year?
Every school, from my understanding, they have the local level, they have the district level, and so you need to know, like, who are the key players for the school. Also knowing the outside resources. And another thing, like I said, the internet's my best friend. I Google a lot. You know, who helps with, if I notice my child's having a reading little problem, whatever, who helps with this and who helps with that? I believe it or not, when I went to the RSD, I was shocked. Some of the issues that I was having in the school, they actually gave me resources. So the school didn't, now the district did. And so also calling the Louisiana Education, I think it's the Louisiana Education Board, going online, getting their information, call, hey, you know, my child's about to start the school. And also sometimes the kids in the neighborhood, I don't know if that works so much sometimes now, but because kids are going different locations to different neighborhoods now, but a lot of times it's figuring out that. But like I said, internet's my best friend, and get it in word of mouth. Sometimes these schools have I forgot what they call it. You could just put in your voice on certain things online. I found a lot of sometimes good and bad things online. So just being well equipped about the people, using the internet, and doing those type of things.
I would say very similar things. I'd add making sure that you get the school policies, the school handbook, knowing what the expectations are. I would say ensure that you have the school calendar so that you know when you're going to have opportunities to talk to teachers. For example, parent-teacher conferences or welcome nights, being sure that you're present and ready at those events. I think also knowing who all of the administrators and teachers are. So getting a contact sheet so that you always have their emails and their numbers in the event that you need to speak with them. And then the last thing I would say is get connected to parents at the school. There might be a school parent organization that exists. There might not be. It might just look like you befriending the parents of your kids' friends. But I think it's important to know the experiences of other parents and have other parents as your allies, because you know, 2 and 3 voices is stronger than one. And a lot of times I think that, especially if a parent is saying something that may well be true and may be right and righteous, if they are alone, they can look like the minority, instead of having, you know, a group of parents come together and say, hey, we believe that this policy is not accurate, or we believe that this teacher is not meeting the needs of our students. So just building allies so that you aren't alone.
Okay. And we're going to do one more thing before we go, which is to provide an example, a scenario that can help a lot of parents out there. And so what I would like you to share with parents when I give this scenario is step 1 to the very end. So the step 1 in terms of your first attempt to address this issue, all the way to holding people accountable. And I'm just going to provide a very common example that a lot of parents experience at some point, which is, my child seems to be having an issue with this particular teacher. That happens a lot, right? It's a student and it's a teacher or it's a staff person. It's not everybody, but it's the math teacher or the ELA teacher or whomever. So what advice would you give to parents in terms of how to address that, from identifying that as an issue all the way to holding everybody accountable to making sure that your student gets what he or she needs?
Well, I'm laughing because it's everything touches home with me. Yeah, them kids sometimes, you know, sometimes they try to do things to ease out of certain things, you know, but what I would do, first of all, I would have asked my child, what's the problem? You know, they'll tell me. Then I would set up a parent conference with them, a teacher conference with the teachers, see if we can set that up. I wouldn't go in for the kill. I see some parents, oh, you did this to my child, and you know, and that just the teacher puts their walls up. So I would be kind of what you call a mutual party, or listen in, and then the teacher's gonna tell you certain things. And 9 times out of 10, so once you talk with the teacher and the child, we sit down and we get together. You know, I tell them why my child is a little upset, and then you know, we go from a plan. Because you know what I tell my kids, this is my favorite line: the teachers have theirs, you have to get yours. Simple as that. You know, I'm all for education across the board. So now, on the flip side of that coin, once we talk with the teacher, and some of them, like I said, they have their walls up, you know, then the next thing I would do is set up for a principal, the teacher, all of us sitting together and going from there and making sure we can just come together with a plan. Like I said, some good teachers, some bad teachers, and this is what that is. And then like I said, I will go a step further. If I feel like things are not working out, I'll go to the district level. And go from there. Probably on that level there, things are going to change. As my dad always say, then people are making a little bit more money and they're going to take a lot of things serious. They don't want to lose their money. So one of those levels, I have to use my daddy quotes. On one of those levels, some things are going to change. So, I mean, you know, I just, you know, once those things happen, things change either for the good or the bad. And, you know, you don't want to take your children out of schools. But sometimes that's just the last result. You want to make that the last result, though. So,
yes, very similar to Miss Daphne. I would say start with talking to the teacher. That can be on the phone. It can be a quick check-in. Just figuring out what's going on from their perspective, and talking to the child, figuring out what's going on from their perspective. See if you can get on the same page. If you continue to have issues, I say then schedule a meeting. I always suggest that students are a part of a portion of the meeting, not necessarily all of it. I think it's very important for adults to have conversations without students, but also for students to be able to advocate for themselves and to be included. And so finding a way to speak with the teacher in a way where you're trying not to be biased, but you're listening to both perspectives. If you cannot come to a conclusion and the problem continues to happen, I then say observe the classroom. Parents at most schools have the rights to be able to schedule or pop into classrooms to see what's going on. Then as it also, I would say here, if there's a trusted member at the school that you have outside of this teacher, maybe that the student gets along with, or maybe that you really understand, I would also talk to that person and kind of be asking that person to look into the situation from you to give you a different perspective. Follow up. If you don't see things getting better, that's when I would reach out to administration. Having a meeting with the administration person off to the side on your own to be able to candidly state your opinion and your need, but then also ensuring that there's a time where you, the administrator, and the teacher sit down, then again, extending that to you, the administrator, the teacher, and the student. If it's still an issue, at that point, it's clear that an intervention is needed, right? And the intervention might be that the kid gets a break during the teacher's class, or that there's somebody the student can talk to if they're struggling and upset. So making sure that there's an intervention that you've documented, that you follow up on. If you find that even after talking to the administrator and after putting in an intervention, after talking to the teacher and trying to make it work, that it's not working, I then would say, here's when you reach outside of the school. That might be going to somebody within that network of schools who manages discipline or who manages parent concerns. Maybe you can go with them and state your dispute. And if you find that that's not working, then you go to the district. And the district a lot of times will very much help be a mediator between yourself and the school. And you might find that you want to stay at the school because things are getting better. You also might find that you want to switch. But more than anything, I say throughout that whole process, take account of everything that happened. Keep up with it. I loved every time a parent came and took notes at a meeting because it held me accountable. I appreciate it when parents called me and reminded me that we were supposed to have a meeting to follow up about a concern. That's helpful. So just making sure that you also just keep up with everything everyone says the whole time to make sure that you serve as our accountability partner.
Great. So like I mentioned, having those receipts always helps keep folks accountable. So thank you for that. Well, thank you very much, India and Daphne. I really appreciate you joining us. It's very powerful to us to have parents, advocates, educators be the ones talking about how to support parents as they bring their children through this system. So we definitely appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. For those of you who will be watching this webinar or listening to this webinar, all of the resources and the tips and the tools that India and Daphne brought up, we will be sharing with you on our website when we release this webinar, and they will also be joining us for our meetup next Tuesday, so that you can speak with them a little bit more one-on-one in an informal setting and ask any more questions should you have any. So thank you very much for joining us, and we're signing out.